Keanu Reeves stands up to a bully at the airport. What happens next goes viral. When a tense confrontation breaks out on a flight, Derek Carter, a determined teacher, becomes the target of unwarranted prejudice. But just as the situation escalates, Hollywood superstar Keanu Reeves steps in, setting off a chain reaction of support that leaves the world stunned. What happens when a moment of allyship sparks a global conversation? Before we dive into this inspiring story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that inspire change in action. Derek adjusted his tie and glanced at the boarding pass clutched in his hand. First class, seat 2A. The words almost glowed on the small slip of paper. He couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. This wasn't just another flight. It was his first time flying first class, a small reward he had saved up for after years of teaching middle school history. He looked around the airport lounge filled with travelers of every stripe, families juggling strollers, business people engrossed in their laptops, and tourists with cameras slung around their necks. Derek's dark brown leather duffel bag sat neatly at his feet, a sharp contrast to the sea of rolling carry-ons. He was dressed sharply in a navy blazer and slacks, his polished shoes reflecting the bright airport lights. His mother had always told him to dress how you want to be treated, and he lived by that advice. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a man staring at him. Derek shifted in his seat, but the man's gaze didn't waver. Tall and broad-shouldered, the stranger exuded entitlement with his tailored suit and perfectly styled silver hair. He looked like the kind of person who walked into a room and expected the world to rearrange itself around him. Derek tried to ignore him, focusing instead on the book in his lap, a well-worn copy of James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. The crackle of the loudspeaker interrupted the quiet hum of the lounge. Attention passengers on Flight 384 to Los Angeles. First-class boarding will begin shortly. Please have your boarding passes ready. Derek closed his book and stood, casually tucking it under his arm. As he approached the boarding line, he heard footsteps behind him. A low voice muttered something just loud enough to be heard. "Are you sure you're in the right line?" Derek froze for a moment, his fingers tightening around the strap of his bag. He turned his head slightly to see the silver-haired man standing uncomfortably close. The man's icy blue eyes bore into him, scanning him up and down as if searching for a mistake. Derek's heart quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. "Yes," Derek said calmly, holding up his boarding pass. "First class." The man smirked, his lips curling into a condescending grin. "Ha, didn't expect that." Derek didn't reply. He had encountered this kind of attitude before, subtle, yet pointed, as if his very presence needed to be justified. He stepped forward as the attendant scanned his pass and smiled at him warmly. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Carter." Derek nodded, grateful for the woman's kindness. He walked down the jet bridge, his confidence somewhat restored. He wasn't going to let some stranger ruin this experience for him. Once aboard, Derek stowed his bag and settled into his seat, taking in the spacious layout of first class. A flight attendant offered him a drink before takeoff, and he chose orange juice, sipping it slowly as he tried to relax. The stranger had taken the seat across the aisle from him, and Derek could feel the man's gaze lingering. As the rest of the passengers boarded, a murmur rippled through the cabin. Derek glanced up and caught sight of a familiar face, a man in a baseball cap and sunglasses, carrying a simple black backpack. He was effortlessly casual in a gray hoodie and jeans, his presence commanding attention despite his attempt at blending in. Derek blinked. Was that Keanu Reeves? The actor moved quietly to his seat a few rows behind Derek, offering a polite nod to anyone who made eye contact. He didn't seem interested in causing a scene, but whispers began circulating as people recognized him. Derek smiled to himself. It was surreal to see someone so famous just a few feet away. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Derek leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes briefly. He thought about the reason for this trip, a national education conference in Los Angeles. He had been selected to present a workshop on inclusive history curricula, a topic close to his heart. It was an opportunity to share his work and inspire other educators, but it also felt like a lot of pressure. Still, Derek knew he belonged here, in first class, and at the conference. The fasten seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers began shifting in their seats. Derek reached for his book again, losing himself in Baldwin's prose. The hum of the plane and the rhythm of the words grounded him. "Excuse me." The voice snapped him out of his focus. He looked up to see the silver-haired man standing in the aisle, glaring down at him. Several heads turned, sensing an impending confrontation. "Yes," Derek said evenly, his tone cautious. The man crossed his arms. "I'm just curious. What do you do?" Derek frowned. "Excuse me." "You heard me. What do you do? I mean, how does someone like you end up in first class? You're not an athlete, are you?" Derek's stomach churned, but he refused to let the man see him flinch. He straightened his posture, meeting the man's gaze. "I'm a teacher." The man raised an eyebrow, his smirk returning. "A teacher? Must have been some kind of lottery, huh?" Derek felt a flicker of heat rise in his chest. He opened his mouth to respond but hesitated. What could he say that wouldn't escalate the situation? From behind, a quiet yet firm voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." The cabin fell silent as all eyes turned toward the speaker. Keanu Reeves had removed his sunglasses and stood in the aisle, his expression calm but unyielding. He looked directly at the silver-haired man, his tone measured but sharp. "This isn't the place for whatever point you're trying to make." The man blinked, clearly taken aback. "I wasn't—" "You were," Keanu interjected, his voice unwavering. "Sit down and leave him alone." For a moment, no one moved. The weight of the actor's words seemed to hang in the air. The man glanced around, suddenly aware of the judgmental stares from the other passengers. Muttering under his breath, he slunk back to his seat, his face flushed with embarrassment. Derek exhaled, the tension in his body releasing slightly. He turned to Keanu and nodded. "Thank you." Keanu offered a small smile. "Anytime." The flight attendant approached, her voice soft but firm. "Is everything all right here?" Derek nodded again. "Yes, thank you." As the flight resumed its calm rhythm, Derek's mind raced. He had always believed in handling these moments with grace, but having someone stand up for him felt different. It felt empowering. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a story that would ripple far beyond this plane. The cabin hummed with the ambient noise of the flight, but Derek couldn't shake the tension hanging in the air. He thumbed the edge of his book, attempting to dive back into Baldwin's eloquent words, but his mind wouldn't let him focus. The brief confrontation with the silver-haired man had left him rattled. Even though Keanu Reeves had stepped in, Derek felt the sting of the man's words lingering, like a stubborn splinter under his skin. Across the aisle, the man shifted in his seat, making a show of sighing and muttering under his breath. Derek caught fragments of his grumble's words like overreacting and ridiculous, but he kept his eyes fixed on the pages of his book. He had no intention of giving the man more ammunition. Still, he couldn't help but notice how the other first-class passengers seemed to steal glances at him, their expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. Derek shifted in his seat, debating whether he should speak up or let it go. He didn't want to draw more attention to himself, but he also hated the idea of staying silent. He'd spent his life navigating these moments, always weighing the cost of confrontation against the need to stand his ground. A sudden movement pulled his attention. The man unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, his towering frame filling the narrow aisle. He leaned toward Derek, his voice louder this time, ensuring everyone nearby could hear. "Look," the man began, his tone dripping with faux politeness. "I'm just trying to understand. You said you're a teacher, right? That's great. But let's be honest, teachers don't exactly make first-class money, do they?" Derek felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the cabin landing on him. His grip tightened on his book as he looked up at the man. "I worked hard for this," he said evenly, his voice steady despite the knot tightening in his stomach. "I saved up for months to treat myself to this flight. Is that a problem?" The man chuckled, a condescending sound that made Derek's skin crawl. "Relax, buddy. I'm not trying to start anything. I'm just saying, people like me, business executives, high earners, we usually expect to see, well, other professionals in first class, not hobbyists." The words hit like a slap. Derek's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, another voice spoke up from the back of the cabin. "Is there a reason you're talking to him like this?" All heads turned toward the voice. Keanu Reeves stood once again, his calm demeanor now laced with an edge of steel. his sharp eyes locked onto the man who looked momentarily thrown off balance. "I'm sorry, but what's your name?" Keanu asked, his voice carrying a mix of curiosity and challenge. The man blinked, his bravado faltering for the first time. It's Richard." "Richard," Keanu repeated, taking a step closer. "Can I ask you something? What do you do for a living?" Richard straightened his posture, clearly ready to flaunt his answer. "I'm a senior vice president at a financial services firm." Keanu nodded thoughtfully. "Impressive. But tell me, Richard, does being a senior vice president mean you get to question someone else's right to be here? Or does it just give you the ability to be loud and condescending?" A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin, a mix of amusement and approval. Derek felt a flicker of gratitude as Keanu continued to hold Richard's gaze, refusing to back down. "I wasn't being condescending," Richard said defensively, though his voice lacked the confidence it carried earlier. "I was just curious." "Curious?" Keanu repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Well, here's something you might find curious. People save up, work hard, and make sacrifices to enjoy the things they've earned. That's what Derek did. That's what I've done. And frankly, your comments say a lot more about you than they do about him." The cabin fell silent. Richard opened his mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it. Instead, he muttered something under his breath and slumped back into his seat, his face flushed with embarrassment. Keanu turned back to Derek, offering a small, reassuring smile. "You good?" he asked quietly. Derek nodded, his tension easing slightly. "Yeah, thanks." Keanu returned to his seat, slipping his sunglasses back on as if nothing had happened. The flight attendants, sensing the situation was under control, resumed their duties, though Derek noticed one of them giving him a supportive smile as she passed. As the plane cruised above the clouds, Derek couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. The confrontation had been humiliating, but Keanu's intervention had reminded him of the importance of standing up not just for himself but for others who face similar situations every day. He glanced around the cabin, noticing the subtle shifts in the other passengers' attitudes. Some offered him polite smiles, while others avoided eye contact, perhaps ashamed of their earlier silence. Derek realized that this moment, as uncomfortable as it was, might have planted a seed in their minds, a small nudge to question their own biases and behaviors. For the rest of the flight, Derek tried to focus on his book, though his thoughts kept drifting back to what had just happened. He wondered if Richard would reflect on his behavior or dismiss it entirely. More importantly, Derek thought about how he could use this experience not as a source of bitterness, but as a lesson to carry forward. Unbeknownst to Derek, a few rows back, a passenger quietly recorded parts of the exchange on her phone. By the time the plane landed, the video would be on its way to social media, sparking conversations far beyond the confines of that first-class cabin. As the plane soared thousands of feet above the ground, the atmosphere inside the first-class cabin remained heavy. Derek tried to immerse himself in the comforting words of James Baldwin, but the silver-haired man Richard seemed determined to test the limits of everyone's patience. Richard had not fully retreated after his last encounter with Keanu Reeves. Though he stayed in his seat, his muttered complaints and pointed glares toward Derek ensured the tension lingered. Passengers exchanged glances, unsure whether to intervene or ignore the situation altogether. Derek shifted in his seat, considering his next move. He didn't want to cause a scene, but he also couldn't ignore the simmering hostility. His inner voice urged him to stay composed, reminding him of the lessons his mother had instilled: choose your battles wisely, Derek, and always keep your dignity intact. As Derek weighed his options, Richard's voice cut through the quiet hum of the cabin. "Unbelievable," Richard said, loud enough for everyone to hear. He leaned slightly toward the aisle, gesturing toward Derek with a dismissive wave of his hand. "This is exactly what's wrong with everything these days. Standards are just gone. Now anyone can sit anywhere, no matter how out of place they are." Derek felt the heat rise to his face, but before he could respond, Keanu Reeves stood up again. This time he removed his sunglasses and tucked them into his hoodie pocket. His presence, calm yet commanding, drew every eye in the cabin. "Richard," Keanu began, his tone quiet but firm, "we've all heard enough. You've been given every chance to sit quietly and enjoy your flight, but instead you've chosen to make this uncomfortable for everyone around you." Richard scoffed, but Keanu continued, stepping closer to Derek's row. You seem very concerned with who belongs here. So let's talk about that. What exactly makes you think you're the gatekeeper of first class? Because from where I'm standing, Derek belongs here just as much as you or anyone else. A ripple of murmurs ran through the cabin as Keanu spoke, his words carrying the weight of conviction. Derek's heart pounded in his chest, a mix of gratitude and disbelief that this global icon was standing up for him so openly. Richard bristled, his voice tinged with irritation. I wasn't being rude, I was just asking a question. I think people are overreacting. Keanu tilted his head, his expression sharp. Overreacting? No, Richard, people are reacting to your behavior, the kind of behavior that reminds folks like Derek that they're constantly being judged for simply existing in spaces you don't think they deserve. Derek felt a lump in his throat. He had never heard someone articulate this so plainly, so unapologetically. Richard's face reddened, and for a moment it seemed like he might fire back. But before he could, another passenger, a woman seated 2 rows ahead, turned around. Excuse me, she said, her voice loud enough to carry, but I think we've all had enough of this. It's a long flight, and nobody paid for this kind of drama. If you can't keep your opinions to yourself, maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here. The cabin erupted in a wave of quiet agreement. A man nearby added, "Yeah, let's just get to LA in peace. Okay." Richard sat back, his jaw tight as he glanced around at the sea of disapproving faces. He muttered something under his breath and turned toward the window, feigning interest in the view outside. Keanu returned to his seat, giving Derek a reassuring nod as he passed. "You handled that well," he said quietly. Derek offered a small, grateful smile in return. As the cabin settled, Derek felt the weight of what had just occurred. This wasn't just about one man's prejudices, it was a microcosm of the challenges he and so many others faced every day. But for once, he hadn't been left to fend for himself. People had stepped up, and that made all the difference. In the back of the cabin, the woman who had recorded the earlier confrontation now captured this resolution, her fingers quickly typing a caption for the video she planned to share: Keanu Reeves standing up to a bully on a flight, and the whole cabin joining in. Humanity isn't all bad, after all. The tension in the cabin dissipated slowly, replaced by a hum of whispered conversations and sidelong glances. Richard remained sullen, staring out the window and avoiding eye contact with anyone. The passengers around Derek, however, seemed to shift subtly. Their occasional glances now carried warmth or quiet acknowledgement, and a few offered him small smiles as they passed on their way to the restroom. Derek exhaled deeply, sinking back into his seat. He looked toward Keanu Reeves, who had resumed reading a dog-eared paperback as if nothing unusual had happened. The actor's calm demeanor was reassuring, but Derek couldn't help feeling the lingering effects of the confrontation. His hands were still trembling slightly as he placed them on his lap, trying to focus on steadying his breathing. The flight attendant appeared by his side, her expression gentle but concerned. "Is everything okay, sir?" she asked quietly, leaning in to avoid drawing too much attention. Derek nodded, his voice steady but soft. "Yes, thank you. I'm fine." She offered a kind smile. "If you need anything at all, just let me know." As she moved on, Derek caught the eye of the woman who had spoken up during the confrontation. She gave him a small, encouraging wave. Derek returned the gesture, grateful for her support. He realized he wasn't alone in this moment. The tide had turned, and the passengers who had once been silent now seemed united in their disapproval of Richard's behavior. Richard, meanwhile, remained in his seat, muttering under his breath, and occasionally glancing toward Derek with a glare that no longer carried the same weight. His bravado had crumbled, and his earlier dominance had been replaced by isolation. The collective disapproval of the cabin had silenced him in a way Derek's words alone never could. Keanu Reeves looked up briefly, catching Derek's eye. He tilted his head slightly, a silent gesture of reassurance. Derek smiled faintly, the tension in his chest easing further. Keanu's intervention had done more than diffuse the situation, it had shifted the balance of power. Derek no longer felt like the target of Richard's ire. Instead, he felt supported, bolstered by a community that had chosen to stand with him. A new energy settled over the cabin. The hum of conversation returned, but it was lighter, friendlier. Passengers resumed their in-flight activities, and the sense of unease that had lingered was replaced by a collective calm. Derek flipped open his book again, this time finding it easier to focus. Baldwin's words resonated even more deeply now, a reminder of the resilience and strength he aspired to embody. As the flight attendant returned to collect glasses, she paused at Derek's row and leaned in conspiratorially. "I just wanted to say that you handled that with a lot of grace," she said quietly. "Not everyone would have stayed as composed as you did." "Thank you," Derek replied, his voice low but heartfelt. "I really appreciate that." She smiled warmly before moving on, leaving Derek with a renewed sense of pride. He hadn't sought out this conflict, but he felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that he had faced it with dignity. And while Keanu's intervention had been pivotal, Derek recognized his own role in shaping the outcome. He had held his ground, refusing to let Richard's words define him. The remaining hours of the flight passed peacefully. Derek found himself glancing out the window, watching the landscape below shift from endless plains to sprawling cityscapes. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, he felt a mix of anticipation and nervous energy. The conference awaited, and with it, an opportunity to make a difference in the field he was so passionate about. This flight, he realized, had become a prelude to something greater, a test of character that he hoped would inspire him in the days ahead. As the plane touched down and the passengers began to disembark, Keanu paused by Derek's seat. He extended a hand, his expression warm but humble. "It was nice meeting you, Derek," he said simply. Derek shook his hand, his gratitude evident. "Thank you for everything." Keanu smiled. "We all deserve to be treated with respect. Don't forget that." With that, the actor moved toward the exit, blending seamlessly into the flow of departing passengers. Derek watched him go, feeling a deep sense of appreciation not just for Keanu's actions but for the unexpected connection they had shared. As Derek stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't sure what awaited him at the conference, but he knew one thing for certain: he would carry this experience with him, using it to fuel his drive to create change. And unbeknownst to him, the seeds of that change were already taking root. The video of the confrontation was spreading across social media, capturing the attention of millions and sparking conversations about dignity, allyship, and the power of standing up for what's right. The first hint Derek had that the events on the plane were larger than he realized came as he waited at baggage claim. He stood by the carousel, his leather duffel bag slung over his shoulder, watching other passengers collect their luggage. A woman in her 20s, who had been seated several rows behind him during the flight, hesitated nearby. She appeared to be gathering the courage to speak, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. "Excuse me," she finally said, her voice shy but earnest. Derek turned toward her, surprised. "Yes. I just wanted to say that I was on the plane and, well, I saw everything. You handled it really well," she said, her words rushing out. "That guy was awful, but you stayed so calm. It was inspiring." Derek blinked, caught off guard by her sincerity. "Thank you. That means a lot." She hesitated, then added, I recorded some of it. I didn't post anything yet, but I thought people might need to see what happened, how Keanu Reeves stood up for you and how the other passengers came together. Would you be okay with that?" Derek paused, his thoughts racing. He had seen moments like this go viral before, and while they often sparked important conversations, they also opened the people involved to scrutiny. But this wasn't just about him. It was about standing up against prejudice, about showing what allyship looked like in real time. He nodded slowly. "If you think it can help, I'm okay with it." The woman smiled, relief washing over her face. "Thank you. I'll make sure it's respectful." Derek watched as she walked away, her fingers flying across her phone. He couldn't help but wonder what kind of impact the video might have. By the time Derek reached his hotel room, his phone was buzzing with notifications. A colleague from the conference had texted him a link to a Twitter post. "Have you seen this?" the message read. Curious, Derek clicked the link. The video, captioned "Keanu Reeves stands up to a bully on a flight and restores faith in humanity," had already amassed tens of thousands of views. The footage showed Richard's escalating behavior, Derek's calm responses, and Keanu's intervention, complete with the actor's now viral line, "People save up, work hard, and make sacrifices to enjoy the things they've earned. That's what Derek did." The comments were a mix of outrage at Richard's behavior and admiration for how the situation had been handled. Many praised Derek for his composure and applauded Keanu for using his platform to speak out. Some commenters shared personal stories of facing similar discrimination, while others expressed how the video inspired them to be more vocal in standing up against injustice. Derek's chest tightened as he scrolled through the comments. The outpouring of support was overwhelming, but it also reminded him of the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a fleeting viral clip, it was a conversation starter, a spark that could ignite meaningful change. The next morning, Derek arrived at the education conference to find an unexpected buzz in the air. As he checked in at the registration desk, a fellow educator approached him, her face lighting up with recognition. "You're Derek Carter, right?" From the flight video, she asked, extending her hand. "I'm Susan. I just wanted to say thank you. Seeing how you handled that situation gave me so much hope. We need more people like you." Derek shook her hand, humbled by her words. "I appreciate that. Honestly, I'm still processing everything." "Well, if you need any help with the attention, let me know," she said with a laugh. "I've been on the receiving end of some media storms myself. It can be a lot." As Derek moved through the conference, more people approached him to offer their support or share how the video had resonated with them. It was both surreal and affirming, a reminder that his experience on the plane had touched a nerve that extended far beyond the confines of that first-class cabin. Later that day, Derek received an email that stopped him in his tracks. It was from a journalist at a major news outlet requesting an interview about the incident. The journalist emphasized that the story had sparked widespread conversations about privilege, allyship, and racial dynamics in public spaces, and they believed Derek's perspective could help deepen the dialogue. Derek sat with the email for a while, considering his response. He wasn't someone who sought the spotlight, but he also understood the power of sharing his story. If his experience could amplify a message of understanding and respect, then maybe it was worth stepping into the public eye. He began typing his reply, "Thank you for reaching out. I'd be happy to discuss the incident and the conversations it sparked. Let me know how I can help." That evening, as Derek returned to his hotel room, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from an unknown number. When he opened it, his breath caught. "Hey Derek, it's Keanu. Just wanted to check in and see how you're holding up. If you need anything, let me know." Derek smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. The actor had no obligation to follow up, but his kindness reinforced everything Derek had witnessed on that flight. It wasn't just about a single moment of intervention, it was about showing up for others, even after the cameras stopped rolling. A week after the flight, Derek sat in his modest apartment, the glow of his laptop illuminating his thoughtful expression. On the screen was an email from an organization dedicated to equity in education, inviting him to speak at their upcoming conference. They had seen the viral video and admired his poise, hoping he could share insights on handling adversity and fostering inclusive environments. Derek took a deep breath, feeling a mix of excitement and trepidation. Public speaking wasn't new to him, but this felt different. The story of that flight had grown beyond anything he could have imagined. News outlets, podcasts, and social media had dissected every moment, using it as a springboard to discuss larger societal issues. The video's ripple effect had been profound. It wasn't just the drama of Keanu Reeves standing up to a bully that captured attention, it was the collective response of the passengers, the universal resonance of wanting to belong, and the courage it took for Derek to hold his ground. People from all walks of life had shared their stories online, many inspired by the way a simple act of solidarity could transform an uncomfortable moment into a catalyst for change. That weekend, Derek attended a community panel discussion titled "Everyday Allyship: Standing Up for What's Right." He had been invited as a guest speaker and was surprised to find that the room was packed. Rows of folding chairs were filled with people of all ages and backgrounds, their faces attentive and eager. Derek took the stage after a brief introduction. Standing at the podium, he scanned the crowd, his heart pounding. The events of the flight played vividly in his mind, but instead of fear, he felt a quiet determination. "Thank you for being here today," he began, his voice steady. "When I boarded that flight to Los Angeles, I never expected to be part of a moment that would resonate with so many people. I was just a teacher trying to get to a conference. But what happened on that plane reminded me, and I hope reminded all of us, how powerful it can be to stand up for what's right." The audience was silent, hanging on his words. There's something I've learned from this experience that I want to share with you, he continued. Moments of adversity don't define us. How we respond to them does. And just as importantly, how the people around us choose to respond can shape the outcome in ways we don't always realize. Derek paused, letting the words sink in. He thought of Keanu Reeves, whose quiet but firm intervention had shifted the dynamic of the entire situation. He thought of the woman who spoke up, the flight attendants who offered support, and even the silent passengers who, by the end of the flight, had shown solidarity through their presence. It's not always easy to speak up, Derek said. Sometimes it's uncomfortable, and sometimes it feels risky. But when we do, we remind each other that none of us are alone. We create ripples that can grow into waves. The audience erupted in applause, the energy in the room electric. Derek felt a swell of pride, not for himself, but for the realization that this experience had sparked something greater than him. After the panel, Derek lingered to chat with attendees. Many shared their own stories of standing up against prejudice or expressed how the video had inspired them to be more proactive in their daily lives. One young man, no older than 20, approached Derek with tears in his eyes. "Mr. Carter," he said hesitantly, "I just wanted to thank you. I've always been scared to speak up when I see something wrong. But watching you and what happened on that flight, it gave me the courage to believe I can make a difference too." Derek smiled warmly, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. "You already have," he said. "Just by being here today, you've taken the first step." That evening, Derek returned home to find another email waiting for him. This one was from Keanu Reeves. "Hi, Derek. I saw the news about your panel today. You're making a real difference, and I couldn't be prouder to have been a small part of your story. If there's ever anything you need, whether it's support for a project or just someone to talk to, you've got my number. Take care, Keanu." Derek sat back in his chair, a smile spreading across his face. Keanu's humility and sincerity never ceased to amaze him. The actor had turned a moment of advocacy into a lasting connection, showing that standing up for someone wasn't just about a single act, it was about continuing to show up, even after the moment had passed. Months later, Derek's work as an educator took on a new dimension. The attention from the flight had opened doors he never anticipated, allowing him to partner with organizations focused on equity and inclusion. He launched a series of workshops for educators, teaching them how to create safe, inclusive spaces for their students. He didn't see himself as a hero, just a man who had been in the right place at the right time, surrounded by the right people. But Derek carried the lesson of that flight with him everywhere he went, the importance of courage, community, and kindness. As Derek stood before another classroom of teachers, ready to begin his workshop, he glanced at the small framed photo he had brought with him. It was a candid shot from the flight taken by one of the passengers, showing Keanu Reeves standing in the aisle, calm and composed, with Derek seated nearby. The caption beneath it read, "One moment can change everything." Derek smiled, his heart full. He was ready to create more moments like that, moments that reminded people of the power of unity, the courage of standing up, and the beauty of what happens when we choose to believe in each other.